if this election isn't won, I'm not sure that you'll ever have another election in this country. I actually say that the date, remember this, November 5th, I believe it's going to be the most important date in the history of our country. Now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole, that's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country.
What does that mean? He's going to exact a bloodbath? There's something wrong here.
Many Americans continue to wonder, should President Trump be president?
Now we'll get into Trump in a second, but first, another shutdown showdown. Congress is scrambling to avert a partial government shutdown this week after leaders blew through their plan to unveil a funding proposal over the weekend. And the clock is ticking. A slew of departments and agencies will shut down on Friday at midnight if Congress fails to approve funding by then. Sources say the current hangup is over dollars for the Department of Homeland Security. Also this week, chatter is increasing about if and how Congress will send more aid to Ukraine as officials in the U.S. and overseas sound the alarm about Kyiv's standing in its war against Russia. Speaker Mike Johnson said Congress will tackle Ukraine aid after government funding wraps up, a reality that is inching closer and closer. And an update from the campaign trail. RFK Jr.'s Veep stakes speculation is heating up after a new name entered the fray over the weekend. But first, some breaking news this morning. Former President Trump is hitting back after a weekend of news coverage about his comments that there would be a, quote, bloodbath if he loses the election in November. Trump says Democrats misinterpreted his remarks. He claims he was talking about the auto industry. Let's bring in Brett Samuels, White House reporter for The Hill, to break down this story and more. Brett, a busy week shaping up in Washington, but let's start with that Trump Truth Social post from this morning. Is he walking back those bloodbath comments?
Well, Michael, he's walking them back as much as he's really going on offense and hitting back over these comments. We've seen former President Trump and his allies basically say he's being taken out of context, that if you look at his full remarks, he was saying the auto industry will face a bloodbath if he loses November's election, and not speaking more broadly about the country. But the problem for Trump here is, his track record is that he's made incendiary comments. Obviously, January 6th, he, was saying supporters should come. It'll be a wild time, saying they should march to the Capitol. So, Democrats basically say that there's no ambiguity here, that Trump, has made clear that he's, inciting violence, essentially. But Trump and his team are really quite outraged by this and feel like he's being sort of blatantly taken out of context here.
Now, Brett, it's worth noting that Trump is taking a lot of heat from both sides of the aisle for those comments. We showed some of Bill Cassidy at the top of the show, Republican from Louisiana, a senator, who I will note is no cheerleader for Trump. But he said, quote, the general tone of the speech is why Americans continue to wonder, should President Trump be president? He went on to say that, quote, he always walks up to the edge on that rhetoric. And again, that's why people are concerned. At the end of the day, Brett, do you think comments like this from Trump could chip away at some of his support as you get into the 2024 general?
Yeah, it's sort of this double-edged sword where, Trump makes these sort of outrageous statements. The media, covers them breathlessly. And then Trump supporters basically further dig in and are further emboldened to support him because they feel like he's being unfairly targeted. But the problem is Trump needs more than his base to win a general election. And when he says things like this, when he says, migrants are animals who are poisoning the blood of the country, those are the kinds of comments that, turn off moderate voters and could ultimately be a problem for Trump in November when he needs to expand his base.
Now let's turn to another topic, government funding. This is the umpteenth time we're up against a government funding deadline. That partial shutdown deadline creeping up upon us on Friday. Now, Republicans on Sunday said it was recent involvement from the White House in negotiations that prompted this holdup, which is focused on funding for DHS. Now, Democrats are said to be pushing for more funding for pay equity for the TSA, while Republicans want additional money for ICE's detention and enforcement efforts. Brett, what are you hearing from your sources at the White House?
So a White House official told me that, they essentially push for this DHS funding, that they feel that it's Republicans actually who, by opposing this funding, are putting border security at risk, who are opposing about $1.5 billion that would be put toward resources for border security, for bolstering the border, which is obviously a big concern for Republicans. So really, this is the White House saying, hey, we have come forward with this proposal. It's up to Speaker Johnson to accept it. And by not accepting it, the White House is basically saying it's Republicans who are really putting border security at risk. So, surprise, surprise, immigration is sort of at the center of this hang-up as we head toward a shutdown potentially.
Yeah, you're sort of alluding to what I was going to ask you next, that fact that it's no surprise this is all coming down to DHS funding, since immigration has dominated debates in Washington, on the campaign trail, and border security has been a key weak spot for the president. Going off that beat there, Brett, does it seem like White House officials and the president is trying to go on offense with this government funding and the DHS funding, try to notch a messaging win when you talk about this debate surrounding immigration?
Definitely. You know, the White House has been sort of battered over immigration and over border security for several months. Republicans saying this is the Biden border crisis, that he's not doing enough to address the surge there at the southern border. And this is the White House basically saying, hey, we are putting forward a proposal on this. We are looking to spend over $1 billion to increase resources at the border. And it's up to Republicans to accept it. So, you know, just like we saw when President Biden went to the southern border and said that he supported this bipartisan border security bill that was put forward in the Senate, that it's on Republicans in the House to accept it. Sort of a similar message here, where the White House is trying to say, we're doing our part, we're putting forward ideas and solutions, and now it's up to Republicans to take the win, essentially.
I want to move on to another topic, Brett, Ukraine aid, which is sort of being teed up as the next legislative fight up on Capitol Hill. The House is in session this week, Senate also working on government funding. Then both chambers leave D.C. for a 2-week recess. Can Ukraine wait that long to get U.S. assistance? What's the White House saying about the urgency here? There's no expectation that Congress will tackle Ukraine aid this week as they focus on government funding, which means it'll have to wait at least 2 more weeks.
So White House officials have basically said, you know, Ukraine has already waited too long, that they've already, with this lapse in funding from Congress, Ukraine has already started to see losses on the battlefield, that Russia is, you know, getting more aggressive and taking key cities, key spots in Ukraine as they sort of press forward. So the message from the White House is this has already waited too long. It can't wait longer. But obviously it's going to, because as you alluded to, Speaker Johnson is in no rush to bring this up, you know, in the coming days. So the White House is going to continue to beat the drum that this is in the United States' best interest to continue to support Ukraine. And every day that passes without that support is further jeopardizing Ukraine in its fight against Russia.
Yeah, let's stick with Ukraine aid for a second, Brett. Speaker Johnson told Senate Republicans last week that he wants to move on Ukraine aid, but the ultimate legislation will look different from the Senate supplemental, which, of course, the White House endorsed, had a widespread bipartisan vote in the Senate. Based on what you're hearing from sources, do you think President Biden will accept foreign aid legislation that's not the Senate bill, or is he going to stand his ground for that supplemental, which, of course, he and Democrats have really been pushing for? I mean, what are his red lines here?
Look, in a perfect world, obviously the White House would love to see that Senate supplemental pass the House as is, go to President Biden's desk, and you get funding for Ukraine, for Israel, for humanitarian aid in Gaza, for Indo-Pacific allies. All of that's included in that Senate bill. But at the end of the day, if the House were to pass just Ukraine aid, I think the White House would take that win. Officials have obviously made clear it's very urgent that Ukraine gets that support. There's also the consideration that Israel aid, for example, may be a little easier to pass as a standalone moving forward. So, you know, certainly the White House is going to continue to say that the House should pass the Senate supplemental. But if the House does just pass Ukraine aid as its own standalone thing, I think we would see President Biden happily sign that.
Yeah, I think you're right on that one. Let's now move on to the campaign trail, where we officially have a rematch. President Biden, former President Trump, both clinched their respective party nominations last week. Let's focus on the Biden campaign first, Brett. The Hill has new reporting on Democrats working to rebuild the coalition that helped Biden win the White House back in 2020. Tell us about that effort.
Yeah, so, you know, in 2020, President Biden carried Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. And to do that, he obviously had to build sort of a very diverse coalition that differed from state to state. In Michigan, you know, it was black voters, it was union voters, it was Hispanic voters in Arizona and Nevada. It was disaffected Republicans who didn't want to support Trump in 2020, who helped sort of put him over the top in some of these states. So what the Biden campaign has to do now is try and rebuild that coalition, essentially. And polling has shown that they're behind Trump in pretty much all of those key swing states. So now the work that they're doing on the ground is to try and reach out to union voters, try to reach out to black voters and other minority voters, women voters. So they've certainly got their work cut out for them, but about 7 or 8 months to go here for them to kind of stitch back together that coalition that carried them to the White House in 2020.
Yeah, kind of a lot of time, not a lot of time. We'll see how that shakes out. Let's take a look at the Republican side now. Back in November, former President Trump floated another attempt at repealing the Affordable Care Act, writing on Truth Social that he is, quote, seriously looking at alternatives. Now, obviously, we know how the first time that shook out, an embarrassing defeat for Trump and congressional Republicans. This time around, Senate Republicans are burying Trump's call. That's according to a new report at The Hill. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, for example, said, quote, it seems to me that's largely over. Now, Brett, if Trump does ascend to the White House in January, it's already becoming kind of clear he'll have a pretty different relationship with his GOP counterparts on Capitol Hill compared to what it was during his first term.
Absolutely. And, when it comes to the Obamacare repeal, this is something that the former president brought up that, nobody was really talking about. And I think that Republicans on the Hill were none too pleased to see him dredge that back up because, as you said, was a rather embarrassing moment during Trump's first term for Republicans. But to your point, obviously the way Trump will work with Republicans on the Hill, should he be reelected, will bear watching. Especially Mitch McConnell has obviously said he won't run to be the Republican leader in the Senate should Trump win another term. So he'll be working with a new set of leadership. Obviously, those folks on the Hill have all basically rallied around Trump. They've endorsed him. But I think that to the point of the Obamacare issue, they have no interest in sort of dredging up some of these older things. So it'll be a really fascinating dynamic to see on what points the Republicans on the Hill basically dig in their heels with Trump and on what points they get in line and fall behind him.
Yeah, very different relationship it will be if Trump does win. We spoke about Democrats, we spoke about Republicans. Let's talk about the third-party candidates now, Brett. RFK Jr.'s VP shortlist has been in the headlines a lot, and it's quite a combination of names. You've got NFL quarterback Aaron Rodgers, former Minnesota governor and pro wrestler Jesse Ventura, lawyer Nicole Shanahan. Now, RFK's campaign says it'll unveil its running mate on March 26th, a week from tomorrow. He's a long-shot candidate, obviously, but as we know, third-party bids can be spoilers. What's his strategy here?
Yeah, the VP discussion around RFK Jr. has been really interesting because, as you mentioned, a name like Aaron Rodgers garners a ton of headlines, a ton of speculation about what that might mean in Wisconsin, for example, where Rodgers used to play for the Green Bay Packers. But if he picks someone like Nicole Shanahan, sort of a lesser-known name, it's unclear, what bump that gives RFK Jr. But regardless of his VP pick, I think Democrats in particular are very wary of RFK Jr., of what his campaign could mean as a spoiler. Polling shows that he may be pulling some votes from Biden and then sort of helping Trump to win back the White House in November. So I think you'll see Democrats getting more aggressive basically in calling out RFK Jr., maybe using his announcement of a running mate to do that. Because certainly, even if he's polling in sort of the single digits, that could be enough in a really close general election between Trump and Biden to tip the outcome one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, especially with no labels, still talking about potentially running a candidate. So many curveballs in this race. Brett Samuels, White House reporter for The Hill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
The first State Department charter flight out of Haiti landed safely in Miami Monday morning. On board were dozens of U.S. citizens who were evacuated as the island country continues to deal with escalating gang violence. It comes after Prime Minister Ariel Henry said he would resign last week. Right now, those violent gangs control 80% of the Haitian capital, Port-au-Prince, and are limiting food and water supplies across the city. The State Department says they will continue to help U.S. citizens looking to leave Haiti as long as it's safe to do so. That's all for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Mychael Schnell. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.